Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford. Chapter 9. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 9. Republican Fratricide. Opening with the following quote.
Announcer, do you think the time is ripe for a new political party? Archie, it's more than ripe, it's rotten.
From Don Marquis in The Lives and Times of Archie and Mehitabel. Resentments against the East, simmering within the Republican Party since the 40s, boiled over in the late 70s in a revolt by Midwestern conservatives and impatient new rightists of the West and Southwest against the party's leadership, perceived by them as too closely affiliated with the East, New York City, the banks, big business, and of course, the Rockefellers. The result has further weakened a party already weak, and at a time when many serious political scientists believe the party system in America is so crucial to national political stability, is itself in frightening disrepair. A sympathetic observer of the American right, Richard J. Whalen, observes in Taking Sides, 1974, that conservatives outside the East
had long shown a deep-seated inferiority complex growing out of a generation of frustration within the Republican Party. Money was the taproot of hostility toward New York. Well-to-do conservatives in the Midwest and Southwest had nothing in common with the populists of yesteryear, except a feeling akin to the old agrarian dread of the money power of the metropolis. Mention of the Chase Bank in conservative circles brought instant recognition. It was the command post of the liberal plutocracy. Goldwater's remark that the country would suffer little loss if the eastern seaboard were sawed off and set adrift belonged in this context. He first made the quip as a Phoenix department store executive who could not get Eastern banks to accept his commercial paper.
Suggesting the animosity of this struggle was a memo drafted in '79 by Conservative Victory Fund director Greg Hilton and circulated among select new right leaders listing
grievances against Republican National Committee and other affiliated groups,
noting especially all the way money was distributed between liberal Eastern Republicans and right-wing Midwestern Republicans by the National Republican Congressional Committee, or NRCC, and the National Republican Senatorial Committee, or NRSC.
Number 1. The RNC, NRCC, NRSC all raised substantial amounts of money to fight the Panama Canal treaties. Instead of using 1 penny to fight the treaties by supporting the conservative-sponsored Truth Squad, most of the profits went to feed the bureaucracies of the various organizations, and some even went to people like Howard Baker, Ed Brooke, and Clifford Case, and Mark Hatfield, all of whom supported the treaties. Number 2. In '77, the NRSC raised money by polling contributors on national defense issues. The letter was signed by Howard Baker, who supported the Panama Canal treaties and is undecided on SALT. A number of contributors were upset to learn that their checks were deposited, but their surveys were thrown out without ever being tabulated. When asked to explain, the NRSC said it was a clerical error, but the individual who threw out the polls said he was told to by his superiors. Clearly it was nothing more than a gimmick to get money from conservative contributors and give it to liberal senators. Number 4. There is no number 3 listed here. The RNC also attempted to raise money by using labor law reform in one of its direct mail pieces. The RNC did not explain why NRSC Chairman Bob Packwood and Minority Leader Ted Stevens voted for cloture. Number 5. So far in '78, the NRSC and NRCC has raised more money than it can give to candidates by law. What are they doing with it? Number 6. One thing the NRCC is doing with their money is hiring political aides for Gerald Ford to help him in his 1980 presidential bid. Number 7. During '77 and early '78, attacks on new right organizations were traced directly back to the RNC. While Bill Brock said he was going to put a stop to the attacks at a staff meeting, he in fact also joined the attack by saying the new right was wasting money and that the RNC was more efficient, a laughable proposition to anyone who has visited the RNC. Skips to 10. Press reports reveal that Wilma Goldstein, an RNC aide, told candidates not to use tax limitation and other conservative issues in their campaigns, and that NRCC Field Director March Miller urged candidates to avoid traditional outmoded GOP issues such as free enterprise and national defense. Skips to 12. The RNC has also initiated a program under the leadership of Pete DuPont to recruit so-called non-ideological candidates for state and local offices. Assuming they are successful, it is only a matter of time before these non-ideological candidates rise through the system and become non-ideological congressmen and senators. Number 13. Wyatt Stewart, an employee of the RNC, has made a regular habit of attacking new right organizations by accusing them of being administratively inefficient and eating up most of the money raced through direct mail costs. In fact, the opposite is true. For example, the 2-year period of 76 through 77, the NRCC gave approximately 17% of the funds it raised to candidates, while the CVF, or Conservative Victory Fund, gave 26%, and NICPAC gave 25%. Number 16. RNC co-chairman Mary Crisp is well known for her attacks on new right groups, CFTR, Citizens for the Republic, and conservatives in general. She also supports extension of the ERA and was instrumental in using RNC facilities to assist the recent March on Washington supporting the ERA. Skip to 18. How much money have Charles Percy, Mark Hatfield, Clifford Case, Ed Brooke, and other liberals received from the RNC and NRSC? Wasn't it, at least in part, money that was supposed to go to stop the Panama Canal treaties? Skip to 24. Any objective source will confirm that the Republican groups sat on their hands and raised money during fights over Paul Warnock, the congressional pay raise, the Carter electoral reforms, the Panama Canal treaties, and labor law reform, and that the new right groups organized and executed most of the activity that was brought to bear.
Facts 5, I'm here just to give a little bit of context about some of these. The congressional pay raise is, well, self-explanatory. The Carter electoral reforms were proposed electoral reforms by Jimmy Carter, which would have made it easier to vote throughout the country. That clearly failed. The Panama Canal treaties, which actually succeeded, and as a reminder, they set up the legal wheels in motion to eventually restore ownership of the Panama Canal to Panama. Actually, wait, now that I think about it, yeah, Panama didn't own the Panama Canal, but rather, I guess, give that land and the control of the treaty back, or control of the canal back to them, or not back to them, but cede the land back to them with the canal included. There's my technical jingo. And labor law reform. I believe it was referring to the Dunlop Committee, although that was under Gerald Ford's time, but still close enough. Basically Gerald Ford had John T. Dunlop as the Secretary of Labor, and Dunlop basically worked with a lot of unions and employers to create some sort of proposed changes to the National Labor Relations Act. They went through the House and the Senate. Ford promised to sign it, but then he was feeling pressure from various right-wing groups, so he reneged on that offer and vetoed it. This caused Dunlop to resign out of shame. Or not really shame, but basically out of anger, rather. Carter tried to rekindle this spark, and it failed. RIP. The message is clear. The Republican leadership, the New Right says, is well aware of the appeal of the right-wing pitch and is quite willing to raise money for its campaign coffers on the basis of that pitch. Nevertheless, when the money comes in, the Republican leadership, still under the control of the party's liberal wing and tied to its Eastern Rockefeller elements, uses the money to advance the careers of the liberal and moderate Republicans. In July of '79, the New Rightists, at the prompting of Conservative Victory Fund Director Greg Hilton, author of the memo, plotted legal action against the Republican Party and the
Turkey triumvirate of Brock, Rhodes, and Baker,
as Hilton called the GOP leadership, for what New Rightists believed to be
fraudulent
fundraising. Hilton and others discussed the plans at New Right Kingston meetings and met with lawyers of the Washington Legal Foundation, the right-wing public interest firm, to pursue the tantalizing idea. They discarded the plan after the memo was leaked to the Republican National Committee. The War Against the Rockefellers. For almost half a century, the Midwestern and Eastern wings of the Republican Party have been engaged in an intense struggle for control of the party, accounts of which by new rightists have given rise to an entire mythology of recent Republican history. In recent years, the hate object of the new right in this struggle has been Nelson Rockefeller, but he is only a symbol of what Phyllis Schlafly, in her 1964 book, A Choice, Not an Echo, a version of that mythology referred to as secret kingmakers of the Eastern business community who have
manipulated and controlled Republican national conventions
since 1936. That year, the
Eastern elite,
knowing they could not defeat the Midwestern Republicans, then
clamoring for recognition,
threw their support to Governor Alfred E. Landon of Kansas. When Landon was defeated, Schlafly wrote,
the New York kingmakers breathed a collective sigh of relief that the Republican Party had escaped passing into control of the Midwest.
Facts 5, I'm here with a bit of context. The book, A Choice Not an Echo, was a book that Phyllis Schlafly wrote for the 1964 RNC. In that book, she laid out this conspiracy of liberal and moderate Republicans trying to basically control the Republican Party and silence or muffle conservative voices to the best of their ability. I should say that she claimed that the book was, just something she wrote up in her spare time, and she was lying through her teeth. Yeah, she was a very active woman, but she put a lot of effort into it. She didn't just write it in her spare time, while she was raising her kids. Like, she went full-time into it and even had the John Birch Society help distribute it. If you can't tell, I don't really care much for that woman. Since I'm Facts 5, I'm saying it, it must be a fact and not an opinion. Indeed, the only function of these Eastern Republicans, right-wing theorists believe, has been to deny election and control of the party to its more conservative Midwesterners. As William Rusher wrote, in The Making of a New Majority Party, the liberal minority within the Republican Party
has always been large enough to compel a certain amount of compromise or adjustment in its direction,
making it impossible for the party right-wingers to
mount a convincing attack on the non-producing liberal verbalists and their welfare constituency.
The history of Republican failure has been
little more than a record of the compromises made by conservative majorities to appease a liberal minority whose sole effective function has been to ensure the defeat of conservatism.
The leader of the Midwestern wing of the party throughout these years was Senator Robert A. Taft, son of President William Howard Taft, whose presidential ambitions were thwarted 5 times by the party's liberals. In 1940, to defeat Taft, a conservative isolationist, the Easterners settled on Wendell Willkie, a New York City attorney born in Iowa who became a Republican only months before the GOP convention, and after a spectacular build-up by Henry Luce and Time Incorporated, who exemplified the Eastern internationalists. As Schlafly has written,
the kingmakers did not care whether Willkie won or lost. All they cared was to make sure they had on both tickets an Eastern internationalist candidate who would continue Roosevelt's foreign policy so that the voters would not have a choice on the great issue of entering the European war. Their objective was to make sure that, if by chance a Republican should win, he would be a man the secret kingmakers could control.
The Easterners foiled the Midwestern conservatives in 1944 as well, throwing their support to New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who had embraced the internationalism of the big businessmen. That year, Taft had stepped aside to allow Ohio's junior senator, John W. Bricker, also a conservative, to become the candidate. But just before the balloting, Bricker agreed to drop out of the race and accept Dewey's vice presidential nomination, to Taft's considerable consternation. In the 1946 off-year elections, the Republicans asked if the voters had
enough
of post-war shortages. The voters had, and the GOP took control of both houses of Congress for the first time since the administration of Herbert Hoover. Yet with the presidency within their grasp, the New York-controlled GOP ignored the advice of Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth.
You can't make a souffle rise twice.
And nominated Dewey again in 1948, shutting Taft and the Midwesterners out. Once again, Dewey failed to capture the White House. In 1952, the party selected popular war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, born in Abilene, Kansas, but controlled by the New Yorkers. Eisenhower, Schlafly wrote, had not
the slightest idea of the tactics used by the little clique determined to steal the nomination from Taft and push him into the presidency. Fantastic propaganda.
Was used against the Ohio conservative by the
vicious and dishonest hidden persuaders
of the East. Facts 5, I'm here with my own little footnote. I just want to remind the audience that in the 1952 RNC, you needed 604 delegates to win. Dwight Eisenhower came to the convention with 595 already in his pocket. I really don't know what type of vicious propaganda you would have needed to attack Taft, because Eisenhower, although he didn't come with the victory already cinched, he was, for all intents and purposes, just about to win. He only had to strike a deal with one guy, former Minnesota Governor Harold Stassen, to secure the victory. In 1956, the Eastern elitists, fearing for Ike's health, wanted Richard Nixon, then vice president and a gut fighter from the West, off the ticket. They distrusted him, Schlafly tells us, because
he was not a creature of their making, therefore he was not beholden to them.
But Nixon, the prosecutor of Alger Hiss, an Eastern elitist, spy or not, proved to be too popular with GOP regulars, and the Easterners had to wait for 1960. That year, however, Nixon outmaneuvered Nelson Rockefeller, that symbol of the GOP establishment. To conservatives, Rockefeller had come to represent everything liberal in the GOP. He was a scion of great wealth, an internationalist in foreign policy, a so-called big spender in policy, a progressive sympathetic to the civil rights movement, and devoted to blocking the conservatives. Nixon took pains to make himself acceptable to the Easterners, who clearly preferred him to explicit right-wingers like Goldwater. On the eve of the 1960 convention, after the platform committee had drawn up a document acceptable to moderates and conservatives, Nixon traveled to New York for a secret meeting at Nelson Rockefeller's Fifth Avenue apartment. There, the two hammered out a compromise platform of their own, which they proceeded to foist onto the convention. It tilted so far in the direction of the Rockefeller liberals that Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater called it
a surrender to Rockefeller and the Munich of the Republican Party.
Worse yet, he named as his 1960 running mate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.,
a Boston Brahmin,
as William Rusher described him, more liberal,
if possible,
than Rockefeller.
Once again,
wrote Richard Whalen,
someone in New York City had the last word.
The Rockefeller-Nixon alliance, Schlafly said,
meant that Nixon had paid the price that Taft had been unwilling to pay. He purged himself of his independence and made himself acceptable to the New York kingmakers.
From that moment on, Nixon was never wholly accepted by either wing of the party. Nixon himself was ambivalent in his alliances. A small-town boy from Orange County, California, Nixon had begun his political life in the slashing Old West sheriff style of right-wing politics, carving out a reputation as a
dirty trickster
in congressional campaigns against Helen Gagan Douglas and Jerry Voorhees. His role in the Hiss case strengthened this aggressive image, and as Eisenhower's vice president, he won plaudits from the Midwestern conservatives when he staged his
kitchen debate
with Nikita Khrushchev. But on the other eastern side was his
compact of Fifth Avenue.
The high mark of the post-war period for right-wingers was 1964, a year of disaster for the party itself. The victory of rightist ideologue Barry Goldwater over Nelson Rockefeller at an ill-tempered and stormy convention in San Francisco marked
a historic turning point
in American politics, William Rusher wrote. It demonstrated
with mathematical finality that a Republican candidate did not need the support of New York, Massachusetts, or Pennsylvania to win the party's nomination. He didn't even need the backing of that mysterious entity called Wall Street. There were new concentrations of financial power in Houston, Los Angeles, and elsewhere that had money too, and were prepared to put it where their mouths were. Above all, he didn't need to be a relative liberal or curry favor with the liberals to carry a Republican convention. On the contrary, it was conservative slogans and issues and principles that appealed to the coalition newly dominant in the GOP.
That the GOP could not win a national election without a broader constituency seemed not to bother the right. They seemed to prefer losing, and so embraced a view that was, at heart, anti-political. In 1968, the right was, once again, out in the cold. Nixon, defeated for the governorship of California 6 years before, had migrated to New York City and joined a Wall Street law firm, further distancing himself from his right-wing roots. He successfully sought the Republican nomination as the new Nixon from his eastern base, but was briefly challenged by Ronald Reagan, only 2 years into his first term as California governor, and promoted in vain by GOP right-wingers like Rusher. The new Eastern Nixon recognized Red China and imposed wage and price controls, but the old Western Nixon surfaced again when he ran for a second term in '72, setting up his own committee to re-elect the president to circumvent the official Republican National Committee. Those Eastern intellectuals who never bought the new Nixon image got a revenge many of them had sought since Nixon was revealed as a dirty trickster in his congressional races against Douglas and Voorhees, and put the finger on Hiss. Only when the old Nixon faced impeachment or resignation did the right-wingers reclaim him. Traditional conservatives like George Will and New York Senator James Buckley, however, quickly withdrew their support when the president's flouting of the law became apparent. Buckley angering the new right when he called for Nixon to resign from the presidency. It responded to the mood of paranoia, blaming the Eastern media and elitists and Republican moderates for the persecution and downfall of a president who had proved himself a vigilante after all. Once again the right proved apolitical, cherishing disgrace and defeat as though it were victory. It was precisely because Nixon had separated his re-election effort, creep, from the Republican National Committee that the party itself was able to salvage something of the wreckage that he left when he resigned. The conflict between the Midwestern and Eastern wings of the party intensified. However, as both factions scrambled to reclaim the rubble, Gerald Ford, a moderately conservative congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, immediately named Rockefeller as his vice president. In the White House, Ford came under scathing rightist attack despite his moderately conservative record in the House where, many forget, he led the drive to impeach Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. Facts 5, I'm here with a bit of context on William O. Douglas. First off, it's not an Irish name like O. Douglas, it's rather, William Orville Douglas. According to his wiki page, he was on the Supreme Court. He was known for strong progressive and civil libertarian views, and is often cited as the U.S. Supreme Court's most liberal justice ever. In 1975, Time called Douglas the most doctrinaire and committed civil libertarian to ever sit on the court. So, yeah, it doesn't seem like he was actually successfully impeached at all, but it is clear that the moderately conservative then Congressman Gerald Ford led the drive to impeach the most liberal justice to ever sit on the bench. Despite a vaguely conservative administration, the right perceived his presidential and personal style as indecisive and incompetent. His tendency to appoint to government positions politicians and bureaucrats with ties to the GOP establishment promoted the American Conservative Union in 1975 to produce a disapproving study titled My Guys, documenting the liberal appointments. Worse still, a revisionist Conservative Digest article under Governor Meldrum Thompson's byline said it was a myth that Gerald Ford had ever been a
conservative congressman
and has
carefully steered a middle-of-the-road course as president.
The truth he revealed was that Ford
consistently favored a policy of compromise with the premises of the liberal establishment and the troika
that ruled America.
Big government, big business, and big labor, and its faithful servant, the news media.
He had maintained
a left-of-center tilt
in his politics and in Congress usually opposed the GOP majority, siding with
the liberal opposition,
repeatedly failing to
stand with the people against the giant concentrations of power in government, the media, business, labor, education, foundations, and elsewhere.
New right resentments of the national leadership of the Republican Party exploded in '76 after two deeply disappointing developments. First, Gerald Ford, backed by the Rockefeller forces and the party leadership, edged out Ronald Reagan for the presidential nomination, despite the fact that Reagan had waged a hard-hitting and valiant challenge that actually won a majority of votes cast in GOP primaries. But more important, in his effort to snatch the nomination from Ford, Reagan, whom most new rightists favored, selected as his running mate Pennsylvania Senator Richard Schweiker, a politician clearly identified with the moderate wing of the party and, in fact, one of the most liberal members. In his 1975 book, The Making of the New Majority Party, William Rusher excoriated Schweiker along with Senators Jacob Javits of New York, Charles Mathias of Maryland, Clifford Chase of New Jersey, and Edward Brooke of Massachusetts for their
purely nominal republicanism.
He linked these politicians to either
the Democratic Party, or the New York State Liberal Party, or Naderist consumerism, or John W. Gardner's nonpartisan agency of liberal good works, Common Cause. They're culturally a world away from the ethos and concerns of social conservatives, and indeed represent much that the latter instinctively oppose.
Ford, taking the offensive, called Reagan's selection extreme and managed, despite his own conservative reputation, to unite party liberals and moderates and regulars, many of them conservatives who declined to bolt for Reagan, to win the nomination. Reagan's so-called sellout, indeed, his need to balance his ticket with a liberal running mate, convinced right-wingers again of the liberal hammerlock on the Republican Party. This was the last straw. A party of their own. Acting on the age-old dream of right-wingers to have a political party purged of liberals and under their own control, a number of new right leaders decided to form such a party, or, failing that, to take over an already existing splinter party. Sentiment for this kind of move has been brewing for some time. As early as 1975, the subject of abandoning the GOP had been seriously discussed by disaffected conservative Republicans who, at that year's CPAC in Washington, appointed a Committee on Conservative Alternatives to investigate the possibility. They found much support for the idea, and Republican Congressman Robert E. Bauman of Maryland, founder and former national chairman of YAF, and later to become the chairman of the American Conservative Union, summed up the anger of many of the participants when he declared that both major parties are virtually indistinguishable and, in their lack of coherent principled philosophies, corrupt and meaningless. Bauman announced,
"It is the present party structure which has failed us all. Its operatives have demeaned a noble electoral system. Its functionaries have debased the currency of political debate through the glib gimmickry of expensive advertising campaigns. Its masters have made the Congress a stale for preening demagogues and the presidency an imperial prize. It no longer deserves the allegiance of a free people."
There were tactical considerations as well for a new party. Richard Viguerie wrote in Conservative Digest in August of '75,
"I understand marketing, and I don't believe that in my lifetime you will ever be able to successfully market the word Republican. You could as easily sell an Edsel or a Typhoid Mary."
The Committee on Conservative Alternatives, dominated by traditionalist conservatives, failed to reject the new party outright, concluding that the idea should be studied further. A working paper distributed at a gathering of the American Conservative Union state chairman in Chicago, however, called the new party concept
"too high a price for conservatives to pay."
Despite these poor omens, Viguerie was determined to make the move, and, on the last day of the Republican Convention of '76, he called a press conference in Kansas City to announce his intention to seek a spot on the presidential ticket of the American Independent Party, formed in 1968 to aid the presidential ambitions of George Wallace. Though he never sought elective office before, Viguerie said he would accept the presidential or vice presidential nomination of the AIP, apparently because no other prominent right-winger could be convinced to run. 2 weeks later in Chicago, Viguerie and a handful of lieutenants launched an 11th-hour bid to seize control of the American Independent Party. Accompanying Viguerie to the American Independent Party convention in Chicago in September of '76 were new right spokesmen William Rusher, Howard Phillips, Paul Weyrich, and Lee Edwards. At the convention's keynote speaker held forth a thunderous applause on the dangers of
Atheistical political Zionism, the most insidious, far-reaching, murderous force the world has ever known.
Facts 5, I'm here to say I am just as confused as you are. I have absolutely no clue what atheistical political Zionism could possibly mean. Vigiri's operatives moved briskly among the far-right delegates in their polyester leisure suits, passing out expensively printed campaign literature. In exchange for nominating Dallas newspaper columnist Robert Morris, a former secretary for the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and described by Vigiri as
a real responsible intellectual person,
as president and Vigiri as vice president, the new rightists offered the party use of the lucrative Vigiri mailing lists.
The idea,
reported the Weekly Human Events a month later,
was to get at least 5% of the vote, which would qualify the party for subsidies from the Federal Election Commission, both to assist with this year's campaign expenses and to guarantee federal support in 1980 as well. In this way, they hope to utilize the AIP's ballot positions in some 30 to 40 states this year to get a head start for a major new party effort 4 years down the road.
But the party regulars, a flinty and suspicious lot, resented the newcomers with their three-piece suits and slick campaign literature. They rejected the wooing by Morris and Vigiri to nominate their own favorite, former Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, whose distinction, William F. Buckley, Jr., has written,
lies in his expressed preference for hitting a Negro over the head with an axe handle rather than serve him a plate of fried chicken.
Denied access to the party's organizational apparatus, the new rightists decamped, later criticizing the party for, as Rusher wrote,
having lost its mind
in nominating Maddox. If they had found anything objectionable about the party when its keynote speaker delighted the regulars with his anti-Semitic remarks or when the racist Maddox had the floor, they kept their objections to themselves. When Vigiri left with his mailing lists, the party never expected to get them anyway. The AIP regulars expressed relief at their escape. The party's chairman, Wisconsin attorney William K. Shearer, commented that he was reminded of
the girl who was targeted for a rape that didn't come off.
As for the new right money, Shearer stated Vigiri
never gave us any, so it's just like eating caviar. I haven't tasted fish eggs, so I don't miss it.
James J. Kilpatrick, hardly a captive of the so-called left-wing press, was appalled at the new right's eagerness to make common cause with the kooky splinter party and steered clear of the convention with its
gun nuts, food nuts, single taxers, anti-fluoridationists, and 100 passionate fellows who write in capital letters with red typewriter ribbons.
Thoroughly repudiated, the new rightists returned to Washington, intent on seizing what would be left of the Republican Party after President Ford's defeat, and sat on their hands to ensure it. They determined to work within the Democratic Party as well. Believing that inflation would skyrocket under either candidate, they hoped to be able to use the issue against the Democrats in 78 and 80 rather than defend liberal policies of a Republican administration. Indeed, one explanation for the attempt to co-opt the American Independent Party is suggested by Howard Phillips's pledge
to work for the Republican Party's defeat
if it appealed to the liberalism represented by Schweiker and presumably Gerald Ford. During this period of turmoil and disillusionment, the impatient new rightists would have done well to have reflected on the more truly conservative advice offered by Ohio Congressman John Ashbrook, who, in '72, challenged Richard Nixon for his party's presidential nomination. Commenting after the 1968 GOP victory on George Wallace's American Independent Party candidacy, Ashbrook wrote in National Review that Wallace's entry into the presidential race
amply demonstrates a frivolous attitude towards our two-party system, a system which has been a principal foundation of our national political stability. Conservatives should abandon that system only in the last contingency, when the possibility of achieving the conservative goals no longer exists within it. For we should know how unstable the multi-party European governments have always been. We do not lightly toss aside our traditional way, the better way by far. There is room in our parties for disagreement, and a man can make his views count within his party. That is, unless his sole objective is personal notoriety and personal power.
Nevertheless, the idea of a new party has yet to die. In November of '79, former New Hampshire Governor Meldrum Thompson announced that he would seek the presidency in 1980 on a new Constitution Party ticket.
Anti-politics.
Convinced that the political system is corrupt, the new rightists distrust and resent those who work within it, since those who do must compromise, and compromise means cooperation with the liberal enemy. Only the loners are pure. Consequently, any right-of-center politician to achieve a truly national stature is automatically suspect.
By the time they get into a position to help us, they are no longer one of us.
M. Stanton Evans has explained. Those who work with the liberals are soft or squishy. The implications of the right's anti-traditional politics for the future of the Republican Party are immense, given the GOP's current state of disorder and the opportunities for leadership that this disorder presents. With the old powers gone or debilitated, new leaders are emerging, but many of them have already been discarded by the new right as compromisers to be avoided at all costs. They don't want as a future party leader, for example, Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, a relatively conservative politician who has courted a moderate image. Although the son-in-law of the honored GOP conservative and Senate Minority Leader Everett Dixon, Baker symbolizes to many right-wingers compromise itself. He participated in the Senate Watergate Committee's lynching of Richard Nixon, and mention of his name at the 1979 CPAC in Washington elicited hisses from the delegates. An ambitious politician who cultivates the status of statesman, Baker likes to hold his vote until the optimum moment. He has used this technique, knowing the life-or-death power his position could hold over the Carter administration's initiatives in, for example, the Panama Canal controversies. But at the last moment, he rescued the White House from a humiliating foreign policy defeat. He sought to use his considerable leverage to add amendments to the SALT II package. Such fine-tuning exasperates the new right. It is a form of political strategy that they do not understand. It can and does appear confusing and lily-livered to critics intent on a bold confrontation on principle. The right-wing Chattanooga News Free Press, one of Baker's earliest and strongest supporters, did not endorse his successful bid for re-election in 1978. An editorial said that Baker
has too often misused his position to the detriment of the country,
supporting, among other mistakes, the Panama Canal surrender, American aid to communist North Vietnam,
federal invasion of private property rights,
a guaranteed annual income plan, and an
unconscionable congressional pay raise.
Human Events has conceded that Baker has fought
a few good fights
for the GOP, as in the successful skirmish to stop Theodore Sorzin from heading the CIA. Still, Baker's voting record was graded by the Americans for Constitutional Action as more liberal than 60% or more of the other Republican senators. As the New Guard noted in 1979,
while Baker's campaign staff likes to emphasize his leadership in the Senate, it will have trouble dispelling his negative image as a compromiser. His major problem in seeking the GOP nomination in 1980 will be with the dominant right wing of the party, whom this image is especially repugnant. Of all the Republican candidates, only John Anderson is to Baker's left.
William Brock, once senator from Texas and later chairman of the RNC, provoked similar rightist anger for similar political maneuvering. The mention of his name during his tenure at the RNC also brought hisses and boos from the 1978 CPAC in Washington. His inexplicable, to the new right, determination to work with all elements of the Republican Party infuriates them. His attempt to
broaden the base
of the GOP suggests a willingness to tolerate liberals. John Anderson, Republican congressman from Illinois, having taken it upon himself to attack the new right in public utterances, is a special hate object, the object of right-wing purge efforts in 78 and 80. He is distrusted also, however, by conservative Republicans for the not-so-subtle ideological changes he has undergone since coming to Washington in 1960. Republicans who challenged Anderson's claim to leadership pointed to the fact that in 78 he voted more frequently with the Democrats than with his own party colleagues. Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, who endeared himself to the GOP right with his slashing campaign as President Ford's running mate in 75, tried to moderate his tough image in his bid for the nomination in 80. Although he is anti-salt and anti-abortion, Dole tried his second time around to stress the socially beneficial aspects of his free market economics. The right viewed him with suspicion for such pandering. The new right appears to also distrust rising Republican Jack Kemp, despite Kemp's solidly conservative record in Congress. Kemp has made a mistake in the view of the rightists in surrounding himself with neoconservative intellectuals like Irving Kristol, and rather than railing against the welfare state, preaching a conciliatory economics that holds that with sufficiently large tax cuts, the level of government services can be maintained at current levels or even expanded. See Chapter 8. Still, few political analysts question Kemp's own political shrewdness and his aptitude for National Party leadership, mentioning him frequently as a natural candidate for vice president. But that tactical shrewdness has not endeared Kemp to the new right. He has refused, for example, to exploit highly charged emotional issues such as gay rights and abortion, which makes new rightists suspect that he is no conservative in the Wallaceite sense. Kemp has provided this one area of policy on which the Republicans of all persuasions have been able to work together, which reflects his desire to cooperate with the liberals rather than drive them from the Republican temple. In 1978, for example, he infuriated new rightists by campaigning for the re-election of Illinois Congressman John Anderson, then facing a tough primary challenge orchestrated by the new right. The broad policy on which the Republicans united on 78 was tax reduction, specifically the Kemp-Roth tax bill, which promised, with a 33% across-the-board tax cut, to create a surge in productivity, raising tax revenues and individual incomes simultaneously. Mainstream Republicans saw great potential in such optimistic view of things, whether or not key economists thought well of it. After Proposition 13's stunning victory in California, the GOP, counting on a national outpouring of angry taxpayers, kicked off a 3-day, 7-city, 5,000-mile tour to publicize the Kemp-Roth formula. The Republican pitchmen, including Reagan, Ford, Kemp, Senator William Roth of Delaware, and Baker, hopped from coast to coast in a jetliner called the Republican Tax Clipper. Conspicuous by his absence was John Connally, who boasted that he had not endorsed the tax cut plan. The Blitz, as it was called by party publicists, met with only limited success. However, in Minneapolis, for example, only about 250 people showed up for a rally that had been publicized on radio and in the newspapers for 2 days, and that was the largest crowd of the day.
Working people need a break.
Red banners put up by the Republicans, yet the GOP leaders clumsily showed up in Minneapolis in a chauffeur-driven limousine. The extravaganza ended appropriately enough at Knott's Berry Farm in Orange County, California. The new writers viewed George Bush, the former director of the CIA, with suspicion, despite the law and order image of the CIA. His earlier career in public service, he was ambassador to the UN and chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in Communist China, suggests an ability to
go along and get along.
His failure to move up the electoral ladder, he was defeated twice for the Senate from Texas in 64 and 70, after serving as a congressman from Houston, generated doubts about his presidential prospects. 2 of Bush's top aides in his campaign for the GOP nomination in 1980 were 2 anti-new rightists, ex-Reagan aide David Keene and Pete Teeley, once an aide to Senator Jacob Javits. But his most severe problem with the right has been his elitist image.
He was born and raised in Patrician, Connecticut, the son of a U.S. senator.
The New Guard reported disdainfully.
He graduated from Yale University and still maintains a slight New England accent.
Worse yet, he served as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization of scholars, businessmen, and politicians, which the right sees as an effort to control American foreign policy for the benefit of David Rockefeller and the international conspiracy. The new right's on-again, off-again enthusiasm for John Connally of Texas must, in part, be a consequence of his willingness in 73 to join the Republican Party in the depths of Watergate at what seemed to many to be its darkest hour. It is also a consequence of his general disregard for rigid party fealty. Whatever the cause, the new rightists seem, in Connally's case, to have underestimated Republican voters who, in primary after primary in 1980, denied Connally their support, a rejection attributable to the Texans' reputation as a slick operator whom they could not trust, Connolly nevertheless raised money on appeal to social issues through the direct mail fundraising services of the Richard A. Viguerie Company. But his campaign for the GOP nomination failed to catch on. Connolly's consequent withdrawal from the race opened the possibility that those on the new right, having earlier abandoned Reagan and, to a lesser extent, Crane, in Connolly's behalf, would be shut out of the presidential contest or be forced to return to Reagan. Thus, such an occurrence would point once again to their difficulty in finding an acceptable and credible presidential candidate within the two-party system. If so, it would represent one of the new right's fundamental problems, a deep-seated impatience with all the political leaders and leadership in general, an anti-political, anti-conservative attitude that explains, to a great extent, its inability to function with any degree of success in the American party system.